Welcome to Pieces for My Puzzle. I'm your host, Nikki Shipp, and I'm excited to be sharing with you my life with a son on the spectrum. This podcast is for anyone who is looking for quick tips and perspective, but most of all, for hope and inspiration. So sit back, relax, and let's put the pieces together. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Pieces for My Puzzle. I'm your host, Nikki Shipp. Thank you so much for joining us today. Last week, we talked and got a little bit of Dad's perspective. I had my husband on the show, so hopefully you were able to tune in and maybe get a little bit more of perspective from a different parenting point of view. This week, I am so unbelievably excited to have Rupert Isaacson on the show today. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Rupert first before we introduce him. Again, I just can't even express how excited I am. He has a book called The Horse Boy, which I absolutely fell in love with several years ago. And I always wanted to have Rupert on this podcast. So I think sometimes when you put things out into the universe, it's kind of funny how all those things happen. Anyway, when Rupert and his wife discovered that their son Rowan was diagnosed with autism, they felt like every parent would initially, a little bit of heartbreak and also feeling lost on what to do. They began to look into ways to help their son, only to see that the therapies weren't working. He was going deeper into isolation and having uncontrollable fits. After observing Rowan one day in a field of horses, Rupert saw a miracle occur as Bill, sorry. I'll stop right. I'll go right back in.
All right, take it from his bio.
I will. Thank you. Okay. Take two. Sorry, Rupert. Okay. When Rupert and his wife discovered that their son Rowan was diagnosed with autism, they felt as every parent does, heartbreak and a little bit of feeling lost, not knowing what to do. They began to look into ways to help their son, only to see that Rowan was going deeper into isolation, having more uncontrollable fits, and the treatments just were unsuccessful. After observing Rowan one day in a field of horses, Rupert saw a miracle occur as the horses seemed to respond to Rowan. As most of us would continue to seek therapies locally, Rupert and his family decided to do something unconventional. He turned to his love of horses and took him and his family out of their home and left to the plains and mountains of Mongolia, which is also considered the spiritual home of the horse. This inspirational journey led to a book and documentary called The Horse Boy. The Horse Boy is a New York Times bestseller and Sunday Times bestseller. He's also published The Long Ride Home, which tells of 3 subsequent healing journeys he and his son made to Africa, Australia, and the Navajo Reservation. Rupert also runs the Horse Boy Foundation from his New Trails Ranch near Austin, Texas, which offers services to autism families and helps direct several satellite centers all over the world in North America and in Europe. He also teaches the Horseboy Method, Horseboy Learning, which is a homeschool technique aimed at autism, ADD, and ADHD families, and is also involved in other kinetic learning techniques along with stress-free dressage. And that, folks, is just the short version of Rupert's bio. So I just want to formally, Rupert, thank you so much for being on the show today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a great honor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I, all of my friends and family, I've just raved about you and your book. So I hope I'm not being too, sounding too much like a super fan, but I really am. And I want to first thank you because this book really helped me to gain a little bit more perspective even about my son, even though we're not necessarily in the equine world. But thank you so much for offering that hope and inspiration to me and my family as well through your book. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about Rowan and what he was like as a child?
Okay, well, Rowan was developing normally until he was about a year. to 18 months. And then he regressed and he lost his words. He went from being this very engaged little person to disassociating. And then with the disassociation came tantrums, seemingly from out of nowhere. And these tantrums developed and developed until they became self-harming. And he seemed to be floating away. But he was always very loving and very attached. That one thing never left. I used to carry him around on my body all the time. So did my wife. And we co-slept. We did all that stuff. And I think that without that, we might not have been able to keep the connection in those early years. Like most people with that diagnosis, particularly 15 years ago when this was, we turned to the, orthodox therapies, particularly ABA, behavioral therapy, but it didn't work. And it actually seemed to make it worse. My son seemed to be freaked out by it because it was too disciplinarian. And I mean, he'd literally try and crawl out of the door to get away from the therapist. And the more he did that and the more I questioned it, the more the therapists became sort of quite aggressive, actually. And I'm a journalist by trade. And I remember thinking, something's not right here. If you have to sort of shame me, the parent, into accepting a methodology that clearly isn't working, that means that you're hiding something and you're afraid of something. And I think what you're hiding and what you're afraid of, well, you wouldn't need to come on so strong, is that you sort of know that your shtick isn't working and you kind of don't want to admit it. All right, that's human behavior. But what do I do about that? So I thought, who can help me? I need a mentor. So I thought, okay, well, who would be the ideal mentor? It needs to be somebody who's an adult who has autism, who understands the condition from the inside. And this person needs to have started their life as severe as my son, nonverbal, incontinent, tantruming. And they need to have somehow made it. Who's that person? Right. So I thought, well, that person must be Dr. Temple Grandin, because she's really autistic and she seems to have made it.
Right.
And when she was 3, she was rocking in a corner, wiping her poo on the walls. Okay, so I sent Dr. Grandin an email and I said, can I come and interview you? And she said, yeah. So I flew up to Fort Collins, where she's a professor at Colorado State University. And I sat in front of her and said, how does my son become you? And that's how it all began.
Wow. So to hear such a, after your interview with her, was it something that you were like, this just has to be different for us? This just isn't going to be what we're not going to go down this path anymore of the conventional treatment?
Well, honestly, I knew that before I emailed her because it just wasn't working. I mean, I'm practical. I wasn't coming at this from some sort of philosophical or ideological viewpoint.
Right.
If it had been worked, I'd have gone with it, but it just didn't.
Right.
So what she said to me was the basis of everything that followed. She said, okay, Ru, you have to do 3 things. You have to follow your child. You have to do most of your stuff with him outside, and you have to do most of it in movement.
Okay.
And I said, okay, okay, so tell me what you mean by this. And she said, well, all right, well, the follow the child thing is really 3 things in and of itself. The first part of it is you have to follow your child physically. You actually have to kind of be around shadowing the kid. Because he's not going to tell you what he's into. You're going to have to observe what he's into. and follow those things, because that's where you'll find your common language. If you try to introduce something from the outside, he may or may not respond to it. But if you look for something that he's already doing, he's probably going to respond to it. So, well, that makes sense.
Right. Right.
Excuse me eating here, by the way.
That's
It's
okay.
dinner time in Germany.
I know, it's okay.
It's a human organism. So apologies to listeners for my chomp chomp num num burp, breaking
okay.
wind and other things.
Right.
But here we go. Sorry, I shall chew openly while I talk.
There you
Um,
go.
She said, then also you have to follow him emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, what do you mean? Well, she said, really what I mean by that, Rue, is his sensory issues. Because you're observing him, one of the things you're going to observe is that he seems to have tantrums out of nowhere, right? And I went, yeah. He said, and sometimes he seems really happy out of nowhere, right? And I said, yeah. She said, well, it's not out of nowhere. What's happening is when he's having a meltdown, he's probably responding negatively to a negative sensory trigger, but he can't articulate what it is. And when he's seeming to be in some sort of bliss state and joy state, he's probably also responding to some sort of sensory trigger. But again, he can't tell you what it is. So because you're following him, you have to observe what's in his environment when he melts down and what's in his environment when he seems to be in this state of euphoria. And she said, I'll give you some tips. She said, there are some known negative sensory triggers for people on the spectrum. Fluorescent strip lights, straight down direct lighting, echo in a room, the industrial machine noise, which could be like strong noise, like a leaf blower or a jackhammer, but it could equally be the hum of a refrigerator or an air conditioner. And also the smell of industrial cleaning solvents. So basically they're mostly man-made and they're mostly institutional. But she said if you have these things in your home, you should eliminate them.
Okay.
And she said you'll probably notice that when he seems to be at his happiest, it's probably in nature. And that's why I'm telling you to do stuff with him outside, because there are just fewer bad sensory triggers in nature. Outside, walking down the side of the freeway, perhaps not such a good idea. But outside in a park or a garden or forest or something, probably a good idea. I said, well, that all makes sense. But I said, well, okay. But if these sensory triggers are so important, how's it going to help him to cope if I eliminate them from our home environment? And she said, well, because it's about resilience, Rick. She said, if he has a sanctuary away from those things, because he's dealing with them outside in the real world all the time, then he's going to gain resilience. He's going to be a little stronger each time. And eventually he'll be able to cope. She said, think of it like soldiers on the front line in battle. You put them on the front line for a while, and then you take them off for R&R. You don't keep them there, because if you keep them there, they'll go nuts. And then they'll eventually shoot their commander, shoot themselves, and,
Right.
just not do it anymore.
Right.
So the way the military organizes it is they pull them off for R&R and then redeploy them later. And I said, well, that makes a lot of sense. And then she said, okay, the third thing, Rue, is you have to follow your child intellectually. And I said, well, okay, well, that's puzzling, because we're dealing with a 3-year-old nonverbal kid here. I'm not exactly having conversations with him about the finer points of, Assyrian Mesopotamian culture 5,000 years ago or something.
Philosophy.
She said, no, I don't mean that, Ruth. She said, you have to look for his obsessions. Is he lining up his toys? If he's lining up his toys, what toys are they? Are they animals? Are they Thomas the Train trains?
Right.
If they're animals, are they African animals? Are there patterns to which does he sort them by size, by color, by species? Does he know more than you think he knows?
Right.
If it's Thomas the Train, is he lining them up by color? Is he lining them up by stuff he's observed in the videos he's watched? What is it? What is it? But if you look enough, you'll begin to discern patterns. And she said also the stims are going to give you a lot of information. She said the problem with behavioral therapy is it tries to stop kids from stimming.
Right.
Because it says that's socially inappropriate. But of course, it's inappropriate to expect appropriate behavior from someone that doesn't understand what social cues are. That has to be learned much more slowly. So saying to somebody, quiet hands, and then giving them a reward, or worse, taking something away that they like because they're not complying, isn't going to make them understand anything. It's just going to put them in a state of fear and make them try to do what you want them to do because they learn that you'll punish them if they don't. But it doesn't lead to understanding. She said, so in the stims, she said, you'll notice that if it's a very repetitive, pattern-based stim all the time, it's generally indicative of a math science brain. And if it's more exploratory, like flapping the hands in front of the eyes while squinting, obviously playing with light or something like that, then you're dealing with an arts storytelling kind of a brain.
Interesting.
And my ears really pricked up at this. And I was like, okay, only somebody on the inside of autism would be able to tell you something like this. This is really, really good information. And I said, well, what about the movement piece? And she said, well, most humans are actually kinetic learners. They learn best learning while moving because that's sort of how our organism is designed. But particularly people with neuropsychiatric conditions. So I said, this all makes perfect sense. So I went home and I just, in the middle of one of those therapy sessions that wasn't working, I just opened the door and let him go outside. And the therapist was like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm doing what the world's most famous autistic person told me to do, because that seems to me to be a rational piece of advice to follow. And anyway, so he went out and we're in the woods behind the house. Immediately, he wants to put stuff in his mouth. I'm faced with a choice. I can say yes or I can say no. You can hear me putting stuff in my mouth right now. It's French fries. These were not French fries. And we're in Texas, and of course, there's a lot of poisonous plants there. Luckily for me, I had, as a journalist, lived with hunting and gathering tribes in southern Africa and in the Kalahari region. And I know that about 60 to 80% of what you see around you in any given environment in planet Earth is edible. Might not taste good, but it's edible.
Right.
So I got online, I learned the most obvious 10 edible plants. Right. And I couldn't explain edibility versus toxicity. So I said, let's go look for daddy leaves. This is a daddy leaf. You can eat this one. This is not a daddy leaf. You can't eat that one. And to this day, he can feed himself off the forest. And it was in the course of one of these foraging expeditions in which suddenly the whole dynamic changed from autism being something that I felt I had to fight against and almost kind of cure, and realizing, no, I could go with it. And suddenly we had communication and we had exploration and we had science and we had fun and we had, it's amazing. The dynamic shifted completely. But it was in the course of one of these expeditions that he noticed my neighbor's quarter-horse mare on the other side of the wood. And the irony is that I am actually a professional horse trainer. It hadn't occurred to me to put him with horses because I knew nothing about therapeutic riding at this point. Right. And the horses I was dealing with were very overreactive sport horses that would indeed have spooked at his, erratic behaviors. But I knew this mare. I knew that she was super quiet. And he forged a relationship with her, which was amazing to watch. And he would go back every day. And then he would show me with his body that he wanted to get up. He'd literally go next to her and jump up and down with his arms in the air. Okay. Goodness. So I put him on top while she was grazing quietly. And I just kept a hand on him so that I could get him off if necessary. And he would lie on her like she was a couch. And all of his agitated behaviors just went away, really went away. I was like, well, I don't know what's happening here, but whatever's happening here is good. So I thought, well, then what about riding with him? this being Texas, Western saddle, most of the kids grow up sitting in front of mum and dad in a big old Western saddle. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. I get him in front of me. We're riding down towards a pond. He had some echolalia at this point. Most listeners will probably know what echolalia is, but if you don't know what echolalia is, it's when they repeat things that they've heard,
Yes,
but they don't necessarily understand what they're saying. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we're riding down towards this pond, and a big blue heron gets up and flies away. And he says, heron. All right. I had no idea he knew that word. That's appropriate expressive speech right there.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
And it's slowly built. And I just started literally living in the saddle with him. And I'd say his speech came in about 4 or 5 months. And then I thought, well, if speech, what about reading? I began to paint letters on trees, names of Lion King characters, because he was following his obsessions. He was obsessed with the Lion King. And then, we'd do a Simba over like 5 trees over 500 yards, riding between them, learning the different trees. And there'd be a little Simba toy waiting for him at the end. And he flat out learned to read. And then I thought, what about numbers? So I started getting friends and family to cluster together. And one would wear a silly hat, so that one has to go with farts to make it funny. And then we count how many we got left, and then no, they're going to get all upset and start throwing their poo if we keep them in solitary, so we've got to put that one back and put them back with farts because it's funny. And then we see how many we've got, and then we charge at them and split them in the middle. Maybe we've got 6 people, and they go into 2 groups of 3, and that's dividing 6 by 2, you get 3, and round them up like a cowboy with farts because it's funny, and you multiply them back. And he got his basic numeracy. And now I really realized I had something, and I started doing this with other kids, and I started getting this universal response. And what I had noticed from the first day was what mattered was the rhythm that the horse was in. If the horse was what we call collected, which means dancing a bit what people call dressage, it worked amazingly. But if the horse was not in this rhythm, it didn't work so well. So at that point, I was curious, again, the journalist in me. So I started going out to neuroscientists and saying, can you please explain to me what's going on? I got the same answer from all of them. And when they explained to me why it was working, I realized that we could replicate it. And this thing called horseboy method was born. And then what you referred to in the bio as horseboy learning, we now call movement method, which is doing the same thing without a horse. And this is now in schools. In fact, I just got back before this podcast from training a school here in Germany in how to do this with their kids. Amazing. And it's understanding how certain types of movement affect the brain. And there are certain types of movement that open up the learning receptors of the brain, and other types of movement that calm the nervous system and calm down the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that governs fight, flight, and freeze. So what the scientists said to me, in particular, a guy called Dr. Robert Navio at the University of California, who runs the Mitochondrial Institute in San Diego, he said, what you've done, Rupert, through no intelligence of your own, because this is purely by accident, what you've done is you've accidentally stumbled into a way of turning off what neuroscientists call the cell danger response in the brain, the fight, flight, freeze mechanism, the amygdala. And most people on the autism spectrum have overdeveloped amygdalas, and they also have oversensitive nervous systems. Right. The rocking rhythms on the horse, rocking his hips, were causing his body to produce a hormone called oxytocin. Right. Oxytocin is always produced when you do this movement. Oxytocin is the most powerful of the 4 feel-good hormones. It calms the nervous system, but it's also, crucially, the hormone that tells the amygdala, which governs fight, flight, and freeze, to stop producing the stress hormone, cortisol. The stress hormone cortisol is a neurotoxin that prevents you from learning, so that you act, you don't think. when you're in a crisis or a threat.
Right.
And of course, if you have an oversensitive nervous system, you think you're constantly under threat. So you're constantly being flooded with cortisol, so you can't learn. And the oxytocin just comes in and takes that all out of the picture in about 15 seconds.
Right.
But then there's more. The same hormone is the hormone of communication.
Interesting.
So my son, who was all agitated with oversensitive nervous system sensory issues and the amygdala constantly firing, suddenly was being flooded with the antidote to all of that, plus a hormone that made him communicate. Wow. And then finally, when you move and problem solve, and riding a horse is included in that because you have to balance, your brain produces a protein, and that protein is called BDNF. And if you're a listener and you're you're looking at a diagnosis for your kid, you really want to know what BDNF is. So write it down. BDNF. Brain derived, made by the brain. Neuro, brain cells. Trophic, all one word, neurotrophic. Growing of brain cells. Factor, effect. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. What does that mean? It means the brain producing more of its own brain cells. The brain increases its goes to optimal cognitive power when you move and problem solve. Among the trillions of brain cells that you produce are a set of cells in your cerebellum. Again, you should write this down with a funny name that sounds like a Pokemon character. They're called Purkinje cells. Purkinje. We should call them Purkinje because it was the name of a scientist in Czechoslovakia who discovered them in the 19th century, which means they're very big. They're big neurons because the microscopes they had back then were not very powerful. These cells act like an internet within the brain, get the different parts of the brain to communicate properly with each other. They also govern motor skills, that's useful, and crucially, for autism, social skills. Yeah. So you have someone who doesn't want to communicate, that's what autism means, autoism, locked within the self. Auto is the Greek word for the self, autoism, I don't really want to communicate-ism. And you flood them with a communication hormone and a series of cells that govern social skills. And at the same time, you calm down the nervous system. And at the same time, you switch off the amygdala. And we realize, I see, we don't need a horse to do this. We just need to get them moving in this way. Well, how else could we do that? We could do that, on my shoulders, on a swing, trampoline. There's many, many things I could do. Now, the horse will give me the best effect because there's so much power in the haunches of the horse to move your hips. You'll get more oxytocin per second than any other way, probably. But okay, if you haven't got a horse, and even if you do have a horse, you're not spending 100% of your time on the horse. What are you going to do with the rest of that time? So horseboy method and movement method were born. And that's what we've been doing ever since.
That is truly amazing. So all of this eventually developed after your... So let me back up for a minute. What inspired you, though, to basically... This was all something that you've been exploring through the years, right? So what inspired you to take that trip over to Mongolia and just take this big, because I would feel like that would be a huge risk. Like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I'm packing up, I'm moving my family. Like, am I just going crazy here? What was that like? And what inspired you to document it too? Because I think for me as a parent, I and maybe that's the journalism background in you, that sense to document it. But I would have never even thought to document it. I just would have been more caught up in the fact that I'm packing up and leaving and going across the world,
Right. Yeah. From a sort of mainstream suburban outlook, it seems like a crazy and extreme thing to do. But from the outlook of my family culture, it's a perfectly normal thing to do because I was born in England, but my family is all from Southern Africa. My mother is South African. My father is from Zimbabwe. And going and taking long journeys into wilderness areas was just completely part of
Was
my childhood
totally
and
common,
completely
right?
part of my working life and something I did all the time. I mean, and I lived and worked with Bushmen hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, first as a journalist, then as a human rights activist, helping them gain legal title to their ancestral land after they'd been illegally evicted. I'd lived in the bush, so for me to go into a wilderness area,
It was just,
it is a relatively normal thing to do, right?
right,
But to do it, obviously, with an autistic child is another matter. But
right.
why Mongolia? Okay. Well, the thing was, while I had been spending all this time with these African groups, I had been exposed to an awful lot of their traditional systems of healing. And I'd seen them be quite effective. I would expect people who had never been exposed to them to be quite skeptical of them because it's outside of one's experience. But anyone who's ever spent any time in these areas has seen a whole bunch of stuff they can't explain happen during these healings. And if there was nothing in it, well, all those people would be dead because a lot of them live a long way from any kind of Western medicine, many, many days walk. They get sick. And when they get sick, they have to fall back on these traditional practices. And not only do they get better, but I mean, they all live to be about 95, smoking like chimneys, drinking like fish, and, not necessarily looking after themselves that well. So clearly there's something in it. So anyway, I thought, well, it would be good to try to take him to see some of these healers that I know. But Africa is not a horse culture. And this thing happened through horses. So where is there a place that combines this type of healing with horses? Oh, well, that's Mongolia. Okay, gut feeling, got to go there.
Right.
But Africa is very familiar to me. Mongolia was not. So I was very intimidated by the trip. However, I had a friend who specialized in expeditions in Central Asia. And I asked him, I said, if you were going to do this, do you know anyone that you would put this trip together with? He said, yes, I have a bloke for you. He's called Tulga Otgon Batar. He speaks perfect English. He will get what you're doing, and talk to him. So I made contact with Tulga and said, and Tulga emailed me back going, you want a what? I'm like, yeah, I know. And he's like, all right, why not? So off we went, and we spent a month in Mongolia, journeying from the horse lands, which are around the plains areas around the capital, Ulaanbaatar, and up, and eventually ending up in Siberia in the north, in the mountains, where the reindeer herders, the reindeer people live. And they have a very, very strong tradition of this kind of healing. And we came back with a very different kid. So he became toilet trained on that trip. Hours after he had, about 24 hours after he'd left the reindeer healer, the tantrums they didn't completely go away, but they lessened by about 90%.
That's amazing.
And then the healer said to me, well, Rupert, actually, you've got to do 3 more trips like this to make the healing stick. I went, oh, really? Okay. You went, yeah. I went, oh, okay. He said, but listen, I know it's not so easy to get into Siberia. He said, we talked, he said, I know you have contacts in Africa. He said, the healers down there, they're very good. But you'll need to do 3 more trips, So I said, okay. So I did. I took him to the bush.
How soon of a time span?
I did it the following 3 years. So 2007, we were in Mongolia. 2008, we were in the Kalahari with the Bushmen in Africa. Okay. 2009, we were in the Australian Daintree rainforest in Queensland with a Kuku Yalanji Aboriginal shaman. And in 2010, we were on the Navajo reservation. And each time there was a really dramatic shift. Now, I wrote 2 books about it. One called The Horse Boy, which is the one about Mongolia, and one called The Long Ride Home, which is the other 3 trips. And at the beginning, people sort of missed the point a bit. And they said, oh, are you saying that shamanism cures autism? Or are you saying that horses cure autism? So, no, of course I'm not saying something as stupid as that. Come on. What I'm saying is that this type of movement on a horse ended up having this effect on the brain. This is backed
Right.
up by neuroscientists. This is not some opinion of some English hippie.
Right.
And although I am an English hippie, and it's not that shamanism cures anything, but it does seem to help people. And it's not that autism is something that can be cured at all.
It's
I'm not
gonna
trying
go
to
away.
cure.
Right.
No, fuck no. Sorry, I just said fuck. Sorry, did I say fuck?
It's
I apologize. I said
It's
fuck.
okay.
Fuck
You
me, I
can
said fuck. Okay,
you
so,
can say
but,
whatever you want. It's
good.
okay. It's not a censored show.
But, one gets annoyed with these questions because they distract from the important
Right.
work, which is no. However, I don't want to cure autism because it's not possible to cure autism.
Right.
And you wouldn't want to cure autism because there's many gifts that come with autism. There's many, many, many good things about autism. And autism is a perfectly viable way of going through life. When I met Temple Grandin, for example, in her office, she was stimming, and she was stimming quite hard. But she's published more books than I have,
Right.
and she's more successful than I am, and
Right.
she's got more degrees than I do. So
Right.
clearly being autistic is okay, more than okay.
Right.
But there are skills that need to be learned about
Right.
navigating the neurotypical world. And just like you need a driving license,
Right.
and there are social skills that need to be learned if you're going to navigate safely. And there was suffering involved,
Right.
sensory
Right.
suffering, confusion, this sort of thing. And those things, yes, those things I wanted to address. I wanted
Right.
him to learn skills, and I wanted to assuage his suffering.
And
But I
also
didn't want to stop him
help
from
them to
being autistic.
understand. Yeah, and to help them
Indeed.
understand. They don't know why, that at least I see that with Drayson. He doesn't always necessarily, I think, know why he's doing those things. So giving him an understanding of that is
Exactly.
always, has been mind-blowing for me, at least in what I've seen with my son. So,
Yeah,
well,
absolutely. And
oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Well, okay. So the reality of life is that life is 50% rational and 50% irrational. And you neglect either one of those at your peril.
Right.
So, for example, horseboy method or movement method, it's 50% neuroscience, like hard neuroscience,
Right.
backed up by plenty of neuroscientists that we work with on a monthly basis,
Right.
constantly checking for new stuff, constantly checking that what we're doing is sound. And then there's an irrational side. And that irrational side really boils down to love.
Right.
You love your kid. What shamanism, what kind of energy are they using? What's love, really? That's what they all say. People might be coming at it from a very Christian point of view, for example, and bring a lot of love and prayer in. And if that prayer is coming in with real loving intention, it's probably going to be effective. If prayer is coming in with negativity and so on, then it probably isn't going to be effective, because it's we're talking about the energies that drive the universe and so on. And one cannot fall exactly on one side or exactly on the other side. One has to navigate one's way, because that's real life. That's what real life is. Anyone who's ever fell in love,
Right.
anyone who's ever had a dream while they slept, knows that the irrational is as much a part of life as the rational. And we shouldn't really worry about or argue about this. It's like arguing about, is it raining or not? Well, it's obviously raining.
I know.
The question is, do I wear a raincoat, or do I feel, is it strong enough that I can just walk around in a t-shirt today with light rain?
And that's true.
So, yeah, so it's about looking for more effective solutions, really. And we were fortunate we found them.
Yeah, and I always say that I feel like part of Drayson's progress wouldn't have happened if we didn't have love and belief, right? Belief that he was capable, and also loving him just unconditionally, no matter what, for who he is. And so that's something that I've told many parents, talking throughout the years about, when they've come to us about their son or daughter's autism diagnosis, and I just can't do what you would do, Nikki. And I would say, well, you can, but do you believe
Yeah.
that your child's capable, first of all, and believe that you can do it?
Yeah.
And then that
Yeah.
that all stems from love, right? You love your kid, you want more for him or her, and that's kind of, I always tell people that that's so important that you have that mindset first before you decide what you feel is best for your child.
Exactly. And you might not be able to get to it right away.
Right.
I think when people are
Right.
in the first, shock of the post-diagnosis thing, it's natural to go through some denial. It's natural
Oh,
to go
yeah.
through some grief.
Yeah.
It's natural to not be at the top of your game.
Right.
But once,
Absolutely.
18 to 24 months have gone by, then I
Yeah.
think you have to get a bit more practical.
Yeah. You wake up. Yeah. And same thing. We've had people ask us, don't you want to know why he's autistic? No, I don't have time to figure out why. I have time to help him. And that's
Mm.
kind of always the approach that we've taken. Leave it to other things to maybe make that discovery. But at the same time, I don't have that kind of time. I have time to help him. So, well, we're going to continue this talk on into the next episode. So for those of you listening, please tune in next week for part 2 with Rupert Isaacson. Rupert, thank you so much. This concludes our episode for today. If you have questions or comments or even a show topic that you'd like to hear about, please feel free to shoot me an email at info@piecesformypuzzle.com. If you like what you're hearing, please spread the word to others and feel free to give us a good review on your preferred podcast platform that you use. And don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, keep working on your puzzle, and remember, you don't have to have it all solved in a day. Take care.